In today's session we will learn about Material Safety Data Sheets or MSDS. Hope you will enjoy the session. So let's start. The main objective of this session is to learn how to use the MSDS to protect ourselves and others from chemical hazards. By the time the session is over, we should be able to recognize the importance of the MSDS, access and material safety data sheet, locate essential safety and health information, and interpret the information accurately to protect ourselves and others from the hazards of the chemical. During the session, we'll discuss the purpose of the MSDS and how it fits into our hazard communication program, how to access an MSDS, how to find and interpret essential safety and health information, and how to use MSDS information to protect against chemical hazards. OSHA says that you have a right to know about chemical hazards in the workplace. OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard, also known as the Right to Know Law, is based on the idea that you have a right to know about hazardous chemicals you use on the job and a need to know how to work safely with those chemicals. Right to know information is communicated in a number of ways, including the MSDS, container labels, warning signs, and safety training sessions like this one. The MSDS is the key to all this information because the information found on labels, on signs, and in training is typically based on the information found in the MSDS. There is an MSDS for each hazardous chemical in the workplace. Think about the chemicals you use on the job. Do you consult the MSDS for each chemical before you use it? Ask trainees to identify the chemicals they use on the job. Ask for a show of hands for how many consult the MSDS before they use a chemical. How many consult it if they have questions about a hazard or a precaution concerning the use, storage, or disposal of a chemical. Chemical manufacturers, employers, and employees all play a role in the use of the MSDS for chemical safety. Chemical manufacturers must determine the hazards of the chemical products they make and provide an MSDS for each product. The Hazard Communication Standard also requires manufacturers to label chemical containers. We must make the MSDS available to all our employees and train you to understand the hazards of the chemical and the precautions you need to take to prevent injuries and illness. We must also identify and label hazardous material containers and have a written hazard communication program. You, the employee, must read the MSDS so that you can identify chemical hazards and understand how to work safely with the chemical. You are also required to read the labels on chemical containers before using chemicals. As you can see, the MSDS is really the foundation for working safely with chemicals. It is your best source of information about what chemicals are contained in a product, what hazards you could face when you use that product, what precautions you need to take to keep safe, and what to do in the event of a spill or exposure involving a hazardous chemical. The Hazard Communication Standard requires employers to provide access to MSDSs at all times. OSHA permits different systems for accessing MSDSs, as long as the system provides easy 24-hour-a-day access. For example, facilities are required to keep a list of all hazardous chemicals in the workplace as part of their hazard communication program. This list can be used as an index to an MSDS file system. A binder system could be used. The MSDSs may be stored alphabetically, by chemical type, or assigned an in-house number that is referenced in the index. These binders must be kept in a place where they can be accessed on all shifts. OSHA also allows the use of computer-based MSDS systems that use CD-ROMs or company intranets that allow you to call up an MSDS on the computer screen and print out hard copies. The Right to Know law does not require a standard format for MSDSs. Chemical manufacturers can decide how required information is arranged in the document. That means MSDSs may have a different number of pages, different section titles, or even different number of sections. In the past, most MSDSs had 8 sections. Back in 1985, OSHA established this format as a voluntary guide to assist chemical manufacturers in organizing MSDS information. Recently, however, OSHA has recommended a different format designed some years back by the American National Standards Institute, also known as ANSI. The ANSI MSDS has 16 sections and is more organized and comprehensive than the 8-section format. OSHA recommends the ANSI format because it makes it easier to find information. Regardless of format, however, the same basic safety and health information is provided in all MSDSs. Think about the MSDSs you have used. Were they all in the same format, or are you familiar with different formats? Show trainees samples of different MSDS formats, if appropriate. In the product information section, which is generally the first section of the MSDS, it always contains the manufacturer's name, address, and phone numbers so you can contact the manufacturer if you have questions about the chemical. It also provides an 24-hour emergency number where you can ask questions about chemical spills or exposures. Doctors who are treating workers who were overexposed to a chemical can also use the number. The name of the chemical will also be listed. Sometimes this will be a specific chemical name such as acetone or sulfuric acid. Some manufacturers may use the brand name of the chemical. Sometimes manufacturers give chemical products a product number. These names and numbers will help you match the MSDS with the container label to make sure you have the right MSDS. The date of the MSDS will also be listed. This is important because you don't want to use an old, out-of-date MSDS. The manufacturer may have changed the formula for the product, or new safety information about a chemical might have recently become available. Some MSDSs may also provide a copy of the chemical's label. These labels will generally follow a color and number-coded warning system such as those developed by the National Fire Protection Association and the Hazardous Material Information System. Label information may appear in different places depending on the manufacturer, sometimes on the last page, sometimes up front, and sometimes along with the health or fire hazard information. Some manufacturers will provide a diagram of colored diamonds or bars with numbers. The colors identify the hazard and the numbers tell you the degree of hazard. Other manufacturers just put a number next to the word health, flammability, or reactivity. And some just say something like HMISH1F3R0, which indicates the chemical has a health rating of 1, a flammability rating of 3, and a reactivity rating of 0. Remember, the higher the number, the more severe the hazard in that category. Think about the labels on the containers of chemicals you use. Are you familiar with the hazard warning system they use? The MSDS also contains another kind of emergency information, recommended first aid measures for most chemicals. You should check the MSDS before working with a chemical so you'll know what to do if you have a direct, unprotected exposure. For chemicals in the eyes, the MSDS will generally recommend flushing with water for 15 minutes and then seeing a doctor. For chemicals on the skin, the advice is generally to wash with soap and water and continue flushing the affected area for 15 minutes. But remember, some chemicals react with water. If that's the case, you need to know before you wash or you could do more damage. A follow-up visit to the doctor is also usually recommended for contact with strong chemicals or chemical burns. Moving someone who has inhaled chemical vapors into fresh air is recommended in almost every MSDS, along with a follow-up visit to the doctor. The MSDS will also tell you if it is safe to give artificial respiration to a victim who has stopped breathing. An MSDS will also tell you how likely a chemical is to catch fire and under what circumstances. It will also explain how quickly a fire might spread or how likely it is that the fire could lead to an explosion. The MSDS will tell you a chemical's flash point. Flash point is the temperature at which a liquid gives off enough vapors to burn. If a solvent has a flash point of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, for instance, its vapors could easily ignite and burn at room temperature. The MSDS will also identify a chemical's upper and lower flammability limits, or the range of concentration in the air that can readily catch fire. Concentrations above or below this range are less likely to burn. When a chemical burns, it will often give off hazardous or irritating compounds such as smoke, carbon monoxide, and other toxic fumes. You need to know about these hazardous combustion products in the event of a chemical fire. Think about the chemicals you use. Do you know about their flash point, flammability limits, and hazardous combustion products? MSDSs also provide information about what to do in the event of a chemical release, for example, a spill or a leak. Almost every hazardous substance spill requires personnel to evacuate and isolate the area, either because of health hazards, such as respiratory concerns, or because of physical hazards, such as slippery surfaces or the danger of fire. At that point, specially trained and equipped personnel need to come in to evaluate the scene and determine how to respond safely to the spill. The MSDS will explain necessary measures to contain and stop the release. Responders will follow instructions in the MSDS about appropriate spill containment materials and methods. The MSDS will also describe how the spill should be cleaned up and may also provide guidance concerning safe disposal of materials. Think about what you should do in the event of a spill or leak of hazardous chemicals. Discuss your facility's chemical release response procedures, including how to report spills and leaks, and what to do once the spill has been reported. Safe handling precautions are a very important part of any MSDS. If not handled, stored, and disposed of properly, many chemicals create serious hazards. Storage recommendations on an MSDS might include such items as keeping containers tightly closed when not in use, storing the chemical in a cool place, away from moisture, keeping the chemical in a well-ventilated area or an area with secondary containment, or making sure the containers are grounded or kept in a room with explosion-proof lighting or electrical fixtures. Dispensing chemicals can also be dangerous, particularly when dispensing flammable substances that could be ignited by a simple spark created by the buildup of static electricity. The MSDS will detail dispensing requirements, such as proper grounding and bonding of containers and the use of spark-proof tools around the chemical. The MSDS might also recommend the type of pump to use when dispensing the chemical or the materials the pump or dispensing hoses should be made of. The MSDS also provides information about exposure limits for each hazardous ingredient. The exposure limit is similar to taking medicine. If you take 2 pills when the doctor prescribed one every 8 hours, you would be overdosing. If you exceed chemical exposure limits, you are basically overdosing, which could endanger your health. You'll find 3 exposure limits on an MSDS: permissible exposure limit or PEL, short-term exposure limit or STEL, and threshold limit value or TLV. PEL is the value set by OSHA for an 8-hour day. If exposure to a chemical concentration, averaged over an 8-hour day, is greater than the PEL, you are being overexposed. STEL is the maximum chemical concentration that you can be exposed to in a 15-minute period. TLV is similar to PEL. Usually the two values are the same. However, when they differ, the lower number is used to determine the exposure limit. If exposure to a chemical is greater than those listed, we need to evaluate engineering controls, such as ventilation, to reduce your exposure. If that's not enough, you will need to wear PPE. The MSDS will also include information about a chemical's physical properties. This information might at first look pretty scientific, but actually it is very basic and important. This information will tell you what conditions could change a chemical's form, which could affect the type and degree of the chemical's hazard. For example, the boiling and melting points tell you at what temperature the material will change from a liquid to a gas or from a solid to a liquid. Vapor pressure and evaporation rate tell you how fast a chemical will put vapors into the air. The higher the vapor pressure, the faster the chemical will evaporate. If those vapors are flammable or toxic, this is important information to know. Vapor density describes whether chemical vapors will rise or stay close to the ground. Vapor density below 1 will rise, and density above 1 will stay close to the ground, possibly creating hazardous environments. Solubility refers to whether a chemical will dissolve in water. Specific gravity tells you whether a substance will sink or float in water. The MSDS will also tell you how the chemical should look and smell under normal conditions. Data on stability and reactivity of the chemicals is also provided in an MSDS. This data may include information about hazardous polymerizations and hazards of decomposition elements and products. Oxidation agents and catalyst information. Physical conditions which are required to be controlled. Information on chemical stability and incompatibility, information with other substances which might cause an unwanted condition. Some MSDSs may contain additional useful information. For example, information about how the chemical could affect the environment, including plants and animals. How the chemical was tested for health hazards and test results. Essential shipping information, and OSHA, EPA, or other regulations that apply to the chemical or state reporting requirements. Here are the main points to remember from this session on the MSDS. The MSDS is the foundation of chemical safety in the workplace. MSDSs must be accessible to you at all times. Always read the MSDS carefully before handling, storing, or disposing of any hazardous chemical. Be sure to ask a supervisor if you still have any questions about hazards or precautions after reading the MSDS. This concludes the Material Safety Data Sheet training session. Thank you. We will meet in the next session. Till then, stay safe.